Christian Bible encourage discrimination against women and minorities? I'm Julia Snyder from the Faculty of Divinity at the University of Cambridge, and that's what this video is about. This video is too short to talk about the entire Bible, but I'll offer a few things to think about. In the Bible, there are things that worry some modern readers. The New Testament book of Colossians, for example, envisions a hierarchy within the household. Wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything. Wait a second. Slaves? Yes, and some of those slaves may be owned by followers of Jesus, because the text goes on to say, "Masters, treat your slaves justly and fairly," as if some of the followers of Jesus for whom this text was written may own slaves, a situation that the text just accepts. What are we to make of the fact that this sort of household hierarchy is described and accepted in a New Testament text? Well, one important thing to know is that this picture of household life is in keeping with wider social standards at the time. This text was written a long time ago in the Roman Empire, and in that context, many people owned slaves, and those slaves were expected to obey their masters. It was also often the case that the husband was the head of the household. And especially in higher social classes, there was concern that the household would run smoothly. In fact, stable households were often seen as important building blocks of a stable society. And it's important to think about this wider context when we read passages from the New Testament, because then we realize that the vision for household life that we see in Colossians was not actually more patriarchal or harsher than average for the time. It was actually fairly normal. And it could be that this passage from Colossians was partly written to encourage just that, to encourage followers of Jesus to have the sorts of family relationships that would be respected by other people in society, especially by men who owned slaves. Now, why might the author have wanted that? Well, to make followers of Jesus seem a little less strange. The book of Colossians was probably written for followers of Jesus from Gentile or non-Jewish backgrounds. And in the Roman Empire, the majority of people like that would have been what we would call polytheists. People who, in their daily lives, would have participated in worshiping or sacrificing to more than one divine being. Divine beings who were often represented by statues. Now, the earliest followers of Jesus were Jewish, and they insisted on worshiping only the one creator God, with no statues. And they told non-Jews that they also should worship only the one creator God, and should stop participating in acts of worship to other gods, the sort of acts that would have been typical in their family, and their neighborhood, and their social network. For some Gentile followers of Jesus, this seems to have created tension. Their Gentile neighbors thought they were acting pretty strange. And it may be partly in response to that sort of tension that instructions about wives submitting to their husbands and slaves obeying their masters were composed. The author of Colossians may have been thinking, I don't want people to think that we're strange or terrible people just because we don't engage in the same worship practices that they do. So let's at least demonstrate that our households run very smoothly in a way that other people will respect. Our slaves don't steal from their masters, they obey them. Our wives aren't flitting about, bringing dishonor on their husbands, they're submissive in a way that men in wider society will respect. Okay, now let's go back to the question that we started with. Do texts like Colossians encourage discrimination? The answer is it depends who's reading the text and how. Suppose I'm the head of a household at the time when Colossians was originally written. I'm a husband or a slave owner. In that case, I probably already think that the household hierarchy described in Colossians is fairly normal. So Colossians itself isn't going to make me treat anyone in a more hierarchical or more unequal manner than I already do. Maybe I'll even treat them better, because Masters are told in Colossians to be just and fair to their slaves, and husbands are told not to treat their wives harshly. In fact, even among later readers, the question of whether texts like Colossians can be said to encourage discrimination is actually not so clear-cut. In the 19th century, Christians in the United States debated whether slavery should be abolished, and people on both sides of the debate invoked the Bible as part of their argument. Not only Colossians, but also other passages. Some pro-slavery people said, based on these passages in the Bible, I think Christians are allowed to own slaves. And some abolitionists said, based on the Bible, I think slavery should be abolished. What this shows is that it's hard to predict what people will do with the Bible. In the American slavery debate, the Bible was cited both by people who were for slavery and by people who were against slavery. And the way they interpreted and used the Bible no doubt depended a lot on the values and commitments that they already had before they started reading the text. The Bible can influence the attitudes and actions of its readers, but at the same time, the attitudes and actions of readers can influence how they understand the Bible. This is also the case when it comes to women's roles in society. Today, there are Christians, for example, who argue that women should not preach in church or be ordained, or they think that men should be the head of the family. And these Christians often point to biblical texts to make their argument. And there are also Christians today who think that all church leadership roles should be open to women, and that husbands and wives should be equal partners in marriage. And they often point to biblical texts to make their argument. So, does anyone ever shift from an egalitarian understanding of women's roles to a less egalitarian one because of texts like Colossians? Well, maybe Colossians does play a role in some cases. At the same time, though, Christians today almost never say that slavery is okay, despite the fact that that seems to be accepted in some biblical texts, which suggests that even in the case of women's roles, the way that people apply the text today is probably not simply a matter of the words on the page. What Christians decide to do after reading texts like Colossians is shaped to at least some degree by the social values they already have before they start reading, or which are already common in their social networks. So, what can we take away from this? Well, I think it would be great for people in religious communities to talk openly about passages like the one from Colossians I read earlier, and to use that as a springboard for discussing social relations in our own societies more broadly. Are women or minorities being discriminated against in society today? Are there unjust social structures or employment practices or unequal access to education? How are employees treated? Is people's labor adequately rewarded? Or do our payment structures essentially consign some people to the position of slaves? What can Christians do to promote justice in those areas? Texts like Colossians might make us feel a little uncomfortable, but that discomfort can actually be a great conversation starter and can help us have uncomfortable but important conversations about the state of the world today. In the process, we may discover that there are some things we don't necessarily love about first century societies, but our own societies, don't necessarily have everything figured out either. You may have heard of the Bechdel-Wallace test for films and books. In its simplest form, it asks whether a book or a film has at least two female characters who talk to each other about something other than a man. Now, most biblical texts don't pass the Bechdel-Wallace test. They talk more about men than about women, and they don't record many women's voices. But then a lot of films and television programs and books produced today don't pass the Bechdel-Wallace test either. Stories that get told in our societies today still often talk more about men than about women, and still record more male voices than female voices. And that's unfortunately also true of the books that tend to get assigned for university classes. Far more than half of those authors are male. And people of color also continue to be underrepresented in films and books and university curriculum. In 2016, there was a newspaper article in which Nadia Latif and Layla Latif asked how many films have two named characters of color. And do they have dialogue? And what is the dialogue about? Are they just comforting and supporting a white character? These questions could stand to be discussed a lot more, both within our religious communities and in society as a whole.